Hey guys, Richard Holdner here, and here's the question the internet wants me to ask. Which one makes more power, a small block 350 Chevy or a small block 360 Dodge? Let's take a look. Yes, I know the internet wants us to be a direct apples-to-apples back-to-back comparison between Chevy and Dodge, slugging it out for total supremacy, but the reality is, this isn't that. This is just me looking back through all of my data and finding two examples, one a 350 Chevy and the other a 360 Dodge, that had basically the same modifications. I mean, if we take a look at the specs, we can see that both of them are treated to ported stock heads with 202.16 valves. The camshaft used in both of them were very mild RB cams with almost identical specs. Both of them received the same type of 4-barrel induction system and long tube headers. So it makes for a good combination and a good comparison between the Chevy and the Dodge. And more than that, it shows guys that have Chevys and Dodges good combinations for daily drivers. Everything doesn't have to be totally expensive aluminum headed tunnel ram nitrous turbo combinations. Let's take a look at the daily driver for a Chevy and a Dodge. To get things started on our comparison between the small block 350 Chevy and the small block 360 Dodge, we're going to take a look at the Chevy first. And in the Chevy version, we ran a rebuilt small block Chevy. Started out with a 4-bolt block. It had a cast crank. It had LT1 pink rods, as every small block Chevy in existence should have. This thing also was 30 over and had a set of forged flat top pistons with valve release, because we were going to run much wilder cam timing and bigger cylinder heads and lots of stuff later on after we ran these mild combinations. So this short block was first equipped with a stock reproduction of the factory camshaft we got from a local auto parts store. It was just listed as 180 horsepower flat tappet cam. We also equipped it with a set of bone stock, just rebuilt with a quickie valve job 882 Chevy heads. It also received a 2-barrel intake, a 2G Rochester quadrant or 2G carburetor, 2-barrel carburetor, and the factory exhaust manifolds run with 2.5-inch exhaust extensions. So run in this manner. This was basically to represent our stock version. So we'll run with the stock cam, the stock heads, the stock 2-barrel induction system, and the stock exhaust manifolds. Our 350 Chevy produced 241 horsepower and 359 foot-pounds of torque. And also, with the 76cc chamber heads, the flat-top pistons, the 6cc valve reliefs, and the head gaskets and everything we use, this thing came out to be about 9.1 to 9.2 to 1 static compression ratio. So that's important to note and remember that when we're talking about the Dodge, because it will be actually slightly different. But here's what happened when we performed our upgrades. And basically, this was a heads, cam, and intake, and we also put headers on it at the time. Now, we did a lot of these things step by step, one at a time, but we're just going to jump into the fully modified version. And the important thing to remember is these were very minor mods. These are the kind of modifications that the average guy would do and could do, because you could put a small camshaft in a small RV cam, which would be really popular. You can port your own heads, maybe have them surface, do a valve job, or put different valves in them and stuff. You're definitely going to change the springs with the camshaft. Everybody is going to put some kind of 4-barrel intake manifold and a 4-barrel carburetor on there. And that's exactly what we did. And those are the modifications that most guys will do. You know, we could go crazy and put expensive aluminum heads and go to a hydraulic roller, and we did that later on. But these are the modifications that most of the average guys would do, and this is kind of a more low-buck approach. So what we did was, first thing we did was change the camshaft. We went to a Comp Pure Energy 246 cam, and that cam was a 429, 438 lift, a 203, 212 degree duration split, and 110 degree lobe separation. Now, as I said, very mild cam, very good idle, very good response and drivability and all that stuff. And you can see it's making, even at 2500, this combination is making quite a bit more torque than the factory stuff was. So this is a good combination. We also redid the heads. The heads were taken, the 882 heads were taken to our guys over at Powerhead, and they did mild porting. They put a 202.16 valve package on them. They surfaced them, did not mill them, so they were still really close to 76cc chambers. But the combination of the valve size and the porting, the camshaft, and all that was teamed with, obviously, a better induction system. The 2-barrel stuff is obviously not the way to go. So we put a 4-barrel manifold and carburetor on it. In this case, we ran an Edelbrock RPM air gap intake manifold, very good combination, and a we didn't run a Holly on this. We actually ran a 650 Mighty Demon carburetor. We also installed a set of 1 5/8 long tube headers. These were for a Camaro chassis, run with 3-inch exhaust after the headers, because the collectors on the headers were 3-inch. So we ran collector extensions, and even I think we put mufflers on these too. And at this power level, the mufflers don't make any difference. All they do is just take some of the take some of the loudness away from it. But once we did the heads, cam, and intake and header upgrade, which are all normal things for a small block guy to do, the power output jumped to 362 horsepower and 422 foot-pounds of torque. And as I said, even down here at 2500 or 2400, we're up by from 393, 354. So we're up by, 40 foot-pounds of torque or so. So you'd feel that immediately. Just, it would be very responsive. It's making over 400 foot-pounds for a long range from 2900 all the way out to 4700 RPM. So this is a really good, an excellent daily driver for any kind of, Camaro or Chevelle or even a truck. This is a good combination for a small block Chevy. So now let's take a look and see what happened when we did the same kind of modifications to a 360 Dodge. Just like the small block Chevy, our small block 360 Dodge was run in stock trim, and then we proceeded to make a number of different upgrades to upgrade the performance of the 360. And we should want to show you what the best kind of combination is for the daily driver, for the average kind of guy, just like we did with the small block Chevy. The difference is this motor actually came out of my van, so it was not rebuilt. As a matter of fact, we left the bottom end completely alone. All we did was change the cam, the heads, and the intake manifold to try to improve the power output. But the interesting thing is, and this is a good note, this is for guys that are actually watching and paying attention, if we take a look when we ran this motor in stock trim with the stock exhaust manifold, stock head, stock 2-barrel carburetor, stock induction system, this thing made 231 horsepower and 343 foot-pounds of torque. It's also important to note that this motor, the 360, even though it has more cubic inches, was lower static compression than the Chevy was, because of that flat top piston that we put in there. Even though the chamber size on the Dodge 974 heads, I think that's what they were. Yeah, 974 heads. They list them, and I couldn't find it. We never measured the chamber volume, so I don't know exactly what it is. And it's listed everywhere as somewhere between 65 and 73 cc. So even if it's on the high side, the compression is still going to be lower on the Dodge than it is on the Chevy. So there's something for you guys all to comment and complain about. But the compression is going to be closer to 8.4 or so to 1 with the Dodge. And this was obviously a tired used motor, so it wasn't a brand new refreshed version. So this isn't a direct comparison anyway. We're just showing you what we did, the modifications on both of these, and what the average guy would do. So if this was a wrecking yard motor, came out of a high mileage van like this one was, and it was still running, this thing is running actually pretty good. So as I said, 200 and a whopping 231 horsepower. But what I wanted to mention is we ran this thing on the chassis dyno before I removed it from the car. So this thing made 157 wheel horsepower, and we're showing here 231 at the flywheel. So you guys can start doing your back calculations and figure out how much all the percentage is worth. But here's what we did to upgrade this motor. I'm going to go ahead and show you. On our Dodge, just like with the Chevy, even, like I said, and look more importantly, at least for now, at the 2500 number. So at 2500, the torque went from 329 foot-pounds to 386. So that's a big jump in torque from these modifications, which are, fairly common. The first thing we did was change the camshaft, obviously, and we put a camshaft that was very similar to the one that we used in the Chevy. It was an actually Extreme Energy 250, so maybe a little bit of a leg up, if anything. It had a 432-444 lift split, a 206-212 degree duration, and 112 degree lobe separation angle. We also had the heads redone. We did some mild porting on the stock heads. We put a 202-16 valve package in them. So they were treated to basically, and we did a minor surface on them just to get them straight, not really milling them. A lot of times guys will go 30 or 40 thousandths off of these things, and we didn't go that much. We just took about 2 thousandths, I think, just to get the thing flat and make sure that everything was surfaced. They did a valve job on them, did pocket porting the same way that we did on the small block Chevy head. We also, just like with the Chevy, put a good induction system on it because the factory 2-barrel induction system that was on the van obviously just wasn't going to get the job done. It definitely needed a 4-barrel. So what we did was install a Performer RPM air gap, and in this case we installed a we didn't use a Mighty Demon, we actually used a 650 Holly on this combination. So all of those combined together with the camshaft, the mildly ported heads, and the induction system. Then we also ran a set of 1 5/8" long tube headers with 3-inch extensions and exhaust, just like on the small block Chevy. Run with the modifications on our Dodge, the power output jumped to 354 horsepower. And peak torque was up quite a bit to 427.7. So we'll call that on the Dodge side, we'll call that 428 foot-pounds of torque. Actually a little bit more than Chevy. And I'll compare both of those in just a second. We'll take a look at the comparisons between the two because that's what everybody wants because this is the internet and everybody wants to see a shootout. But what I want to point out is that these are the modifications that we made. This thing now is making peak power at 4,900 or 5,000 RPM. Peak torque happened at 37 or 3,800 RPM. And as I said, we even picked up quite a bit of power down at 2,500. And had we started this run at 2,000, which we could because this was a very mild camshaft, and we did on the stock one, you can see. But the torque would have been up even there. Basically, it just would have been better everywhere. And, you know, the other thing we could have done was if we would have milled this head 30 or 40 thousandths to bring the static compression up, or we could have changed the piston as well, but it would have been easier just to mill the head because this thing had a static compression ratio at less than 8.5 to 1. So we had some wiggle room there, even on pump gas, and this thing would have ran just fine. So now let's take a look at a comparison between the Chevy and the Dodge, and then we can get to our conclusion. So we can take a look quickly at the comparison between the 350 Chevy and the 350 Dodge. In actuality, the 350 Chevy was a 355 Chevy, so it was much closer in displacement to the 360 Dodge. But remember, the 350 was rebuilt and it was a 30 over. It had a forged flat top piston in it, so it did have, you know, the benefit of being fresh and having a little bit more displacement than stock and having higher compression than stock because that motor with the 882 head would have originally come with the dish piston. So if we're actually comparing those two motors from back in the day, this isn't the strict comparison. But let's take a look at our two test motors and we can see. So this is the Chevy, and if we compare that to the stock Dodge, we can see that the Dodge made slightly less power than the Chevy, 241 versus 231. So it was down about 10. And I think we can attribute that to the change in static compression. Also, we don't really know exactly what the cam timing was on both these motors. One of them came from an auto parts store. One of them was the original one that came with the van. You know, we obviously rebuilt the heads on the Chevy also. The 882 heads were just freshened up at least. At least they had something decent, like a stock valve job. And so, you know, you're comparing a rebuilt motor versus just the one that we pulled out of the van. And so it's not surprising at all that the rebuilt version of the motor, even though it's slightly smaller, would make a little bit more power. And we see this kind of carries over. So we'll look at the modified versions of each. So that's the green is the modified version of the small block Chevy. And the purple is the modified version of the Dodge. And actually no, I take that back. The purple is the modified 350 and the green is the modified version of the Dodge. And the Dodge actually made more torque. And that's actually something that we would expect, not because Dodges are inherently superior, but because 360 is more than 350 or 355 in this case. So the bigger motors we would expect, given the same modifications, would make more torque. The 350 made more torque through most of the range down low, and we might expect that given the change in compression. And also there's a difference in camshafts, and the intake manifolds for a Chevy are different than the ones from the Dodges or stuff. And you guys can bicker back and forth about how this comparison went. But the thing that I look at this and go, oh, look at the torque curves and look at the power curves, not the stock stuff, because obviously that's not really a direct comparison. But if we look at the modified versions, these things are surprisingly close. And that's exactly what we would expect. They have similar displacements. They had similar modifications. They both had mildly ported heads with the same valve sizes. They had both the same type of induction system, and the camshafts were very comparable. So this is kind of exactly what you'd expect. And now here's where all the Ford guys can get mad, because you guys were not included. Only the Chevy and the Dodge guys were. But we would expect the same thing from a Ford that would be in this displacement range. If we did this with a 351 Windsor and did these kinds of modifications on it, we could expect a similar thing, because it's displacement and then the other things, the cams, the heads, and the intake manifold, that are going to kind of determine power. And both of these are really good combinations for going out and running around on your daily driver. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn from our comparison between the 350 Chevy and the 350 Dodge, both in kind of stock and modified daily driver trims? Well, here's the thing. Did we learn that Richard doesn't know how to do direct apples-to-apples, back-to-back comparisons? No, not really. Because let's say we were to do a direct back-to-back comparison and make everything the same. And by everything the same, I mean the compression has to be exactly the same. We have to use the same oil. The cam specs have to be exactly the same. The cylinder head flow has to be exactly the same at every lift and RPM and all that. And the induction systems have to be exactly the same. And the tune has to be exactly the same. And the headers have to be exactly the same. Here's what would happen. The 360 Dodge would make more power than the 350 Chevy. Say it with me, not because it's a Dodge, but because it's bigger. That's right. Displacement would ultimately take precedent here, and the Dodge would make more power. But the problem is, all of those things, it's very difficult to make them all the same. Header configurations are different between the Chevy and the Dodge. Cylinder heads definitely are different. Cam timing and all that is definitely different in the Dodge. The induction systems are all different. So it's very difficult to make those things all the same. But if we did, the bigger motor would always win. But that wouldn't give people anything to complain about. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. Daily driver stuff for the win. I'll keep testing.